What would you do if the only way to escape your life was to sell your future to a stranger? Rain hammered against the glass of the 37th floor office, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo her heartbeat. Ilara's hand trembled as she hovered over the dotted line of the contract, her name already printed neatly in black ink. One signature, and she'd be free. Free from the debts that haunted her family, from the suffocating weight of promises she never meant to make. The pen clicked once. The man across from her didn't flinch. He was composed, his posture precise, the kind of control that came from years of never losing. The city skyline flickered in the reflection of his eyes. "Once you sign," he said quietly, "you belong to the contract until it ends. No negotiation, no emotion." Ilara nodded. "I understand." She didn't, not really. The ink bled onto the paper like a drop of blood on snow. At that moment something shifted, something she couldn't name. 3 weeks earlier she had stood on the edge of ruin. Her mother's hospital bills had piled high on the counter, unopened envelopes stacked like bricks in a wall she couldn't climb. The factory she worked for had announced layoffs without warning, and her younger brother, still in school, had started skipping meals so she could eat. Desperation has a sound. It's the echo of a phone call that goes unanswered, the sigh that breaks in the middle of the night. That's when she saw the advertisement. Exclusive contract employment, confidential, high pay, short-term discretion required, no details, no company name, just a number. It was absurd, dangerous, but danger, when compared to hunger, can start to look a lot like hope. She dialed. A woman's voice answered, low and measured. "You've been selected for interview." Ilara blinked. "I haven't applied. You have now." 2 days later, she was escorted through a mirrored corridor in a tower that didn't appear on any public directory. Her reflection followed her on both sides, hundreds of versions of herself, each looking more uncertain than the last. At the end of the hall, a door opened without a sound. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ink and expensive whiskey. And there he was, Lucian Vale, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved from patience and power. The name alone carried weight to a global empire that most people only read about in business magazines. He didn't rise to greet her, he only studied her, as if she were an equation to be solved. "You're here because you need an exit," he said finally. She swallowed. "And you're offering one." His lips curved slightly. "For a price." That was the beginning of the contract. The terms were simple, at least on paper. She would live in his estate for 6 months, under his supervision, performing tasks as requested, none illegal, but bound by absolute confidentiality. In return, he would settle her debts in full and ensure her family's financial safety. But there was one clause she almost missed. The participant agrees to maintain emotional neutrality. Attachment, affection, or intimacy, physical or emotional, shall be deemed a breach of contract. She laughed softly when she read it. What kind of man includes a rule about love in a business deal? Lucian didn't laugh. Now, as she placed the pen down, the contract sealed with her signature, she wondered if she'd just signed away more than her freedom. The next morning, a black car arrived at her doorstep before dawn. The driver didn't speak, only nodded as she climbed in. The city blurred past the tinted windows, the streets giving way to misty countryside where the world seemed quieter, heavier. When the gates finally opened, Ilara found herself staring at a mansion that looked like it had been built to defy time itself. Every window glowed faintly with the promise of secrets. Inside, the silence felt deliberate, as though sound itself had to ask permission to exist. Lucian met her in the grand foyer, his tone clipped but not unkind. "You'll have a room on the east wing, breakfast at 8, dinner at 7. You'll assist with cataloging, scheduling, correspondence," and he paused, "occasional company at social functions." She nodded, trying to hide her nerves. "Understood." He turned to leave, then stopped. "And, Miss Hale," he said, not looking back, "don't confuse curiosity for closeness. It will make things difficult." In the days that followed, Ilara learned the rhythm of the house. Lucian's world ran like a clock, every hour accounted for, every movement efficient. His staff spoke little, their faces unreadable. There were rooms she was never allowed to enter, doors that stayed locked no matter how late the hour. And yet, she couldn't ignore the pull of the forbidden. Each evening, after the house fell silent, she wandered the corridors lined with portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow her. There was one painting, near the staircase, that caught her attention, a woman in a silver gown, her expression hauntingly familiar. The nameplate below read, Lydia Vale. When she asked one of the maids who Lydia was, the woman only shook her head. Don't speak of her. Lucian never mentioned her either. But sometimes, when Ilara caught him alone in the library, staring out at the rain, there was a shadow in his gaze that spoke of loss. One night, she couldn't sleep. The storm outside had turned violent, the wind howling through the chimneys. She found herself drawn to the conservatory where moonlight filtered through the glass ceiling like liquid silver. Lucian was there. He stood among the orchids, his shirt sleeves rolled up, raindrops beating on the glass behind him. The sight startled her, not because he was out of place, but because he finally looked human. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. He turned, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You shouldn't be wandering this late. I could say the same about you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was charged. He stepped closer, the faint scent of cedar and rain surrounding him. "You signed that contract for escape, Miss Hale," he murmured. "Don't start looking for something else in me." Her voice trembled. "And what if I already am?" The storm raged on outside, but neither of them moved. Days turned into weeks. The boundaries blurred. He began joining her for morning tea, asking questions that seemed too personal for an employer. She started leaving little notes with his coffee, things she couldn't say out loud. The mansion, once cold and vast, began to feel almost alive, but every time she saw him reach for his cufflinks, every time his tone hardened after a moment of warmth, she remembered the Closter one line in the contract that had begun to feel like a curse. One evening, during a charity gala, Lucien's hand brushed hers as they danced. Cameras flashed. The crowd watched, but in that split second it felt like they were the only two people in the room. When the music ended, he leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't make me forget what this is." She didn't reply. Her silence was answer enough. After that night, everything changed. He became distant again, cold. The late-night talks stopped. The dinners grew quiet. And then, one morning, a letter appeared on her desk unsigned, written in neat, sharp handwriting. "You have breached the emotional neutrality clause. Prepare for termination of contract." Her chest tightened. She hadn't told anyone. Had he written it? Or someone else watching from the shadows of the estate? She searched for him that night, but his study door was locked. Through the frosted glass, she saw movement, a figure pacing, a shattered glass glinting on the floor. "Elara." His voice broke through the door, low and raw. "Go back to your room. Tell me what's happening," she pleaded. "Please," but the door never opened. By morning, Lucien was gone. The staff refused to say where. His car, his phone, all left behind. Only the contract remained, neatly folded on her pillow, a red line drawn through her name. The mansion felt different now, the air heavier, the corridors darker. And then she saw it, something she'd never noticed before. Behind the portrait of Lydia Vale, the wall was cracked. She pressed against it, and a panel shifted, revealing a hidden door. Inside, dust floated in thin rays of light, illuminating a forgotten study. On the desk lay another contract identical to hers, signed by someone else. The name on it made her blood run cold. Lydia Vale. Her signature was the same shape, the same looping L outside. Thunder rolled again. The rain began to fall, steady and relentless. And as Elara stood there, staring at the name that mirrored her own, one question echoed through her mind, one she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Had she truly escaped her past, or stepped into someone else's? The sound of footsteps echoed in the hall behind hers, low, deliberate, familiar. "Elara," a voice said quietly from the doorway. She turned, heart pounding. Lucien was there. Only this time there was something different in his eyes, something that made her wonder if the contract had ever been about freedom at all. He took a step closer, the rain whispering against the glass. "Before you ask," he said softly, "you deserve to know the truth." And then he reached for her hand. But before his fingers could touch hers, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. The glass panes shuddered under the weight of the storm, and the faint hum of the generator coughed once before silence settled, a silence so dense it felt alive. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She could still sense him there in the dark, the outline of his body, the steady rhythm of his breath, but the moment the lights vanished, something inside her shifted. The air between them wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, humming with fear and something deeper, something that had been waiting in the shadows all along. "Lucien," she whispered. A pause. Then his voice low, almost pained. "Don't move." She heard a door creak open somewhere in the hallway. Then another sound, metal dragging softly across the floor. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a house built for silence. Lucien's hand found hers in the dark, warm, deliberate. "This isn't part of the storm," he murmured. "Stay close." They moved together through the dim corridor, guided only by the intermittent flashes of lightning through the tall windows. Every flash painted a different portrait of the mansion. The staircases stretching endlessly upward. Portraits watching from their frames, shadows clinging to corners like old secrets. When they reached the end of the hall, Lucien stopped. His expression flickered between the light and dark, a man caught between truth and concealment. "There's something I should have told you," he said. "Something about Lydia." Elara's pulse quickened. "The woman in the portrait." He nodded once. "She wasn't just my wife." The words hung there, unfinished, suspended in the storm's rhythm. "She signed the same contract you did," he continued, "under the same terms. The clause about emotional neutrality wasn't meant to protect MIT, was meant to protect her." Lightning flared again, illuminating his face. There was no arrogance in his expression now, only exhaustion. "She wanted to disappear," he said softly. "She came to me for escape, just like you. But when the contract ended, she didn't leave. Elara's voice trembled. "What happened to her?" He looked away. "She vanished without a trace. The night of a storm, not unlike this one." Before she could respond, the lights flickered back on. The hallway glowed pale and sterile, as though the mansion itself had exhaled. But something was wrong. A thin trail of water snaked across the marble floor, leading from the front entrance toward the main study. Lucien's eyes darkened. "Stay here," he ordered. He followed the trail, his footsteps silent. Alara waited only a few seconds before disobeying. She moved after him, careful, her fingers brushing the cold walls as she descended into the main hall. When she reached the study, she froze. The room was in chaos, the desk overturned, books scattered, rain blowing through a broken window. And in the center of the floor, a single object glinted beneath the light, a silver bracelet, delicate and tarnished, with the initials LV engraved inside. Lucien picked it up slowly, as if touching it might summon the past. His jaw tightened. "Lydia Vale," Alara whispered. "You think she's back?" He didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the fireplace, where a faint imprint of a hand smudged in ash marked the edge of the mantel. "This house," he said quietly, "doesn't forget what's been buried inside it." For the first time, Alara saw fear in his eyes, not the kind that comes from danger, but from remembrance. Over the next few days, the mansion's rhythm fractured. Staff members whispered in hallways. Doors creaked open in the middle of the night. Objects shifted on their own teeny things at first. A book out of place, a teacup left on the wrong tray, but soon it became more deliberate, intentional. Alara started dreaming of Lydia, always the same dream. A woman in silver standing at the edge of the lake behind the estate, her reflection rippling, her face hidden by her hair. She would whisper something Alara couldn't hear, then turn away as the water rose around her ankles. When Alara woke, her pillow was damp with tears she didn't remember shedding. One evening, Lucien found her in the library, surrounded by old ledgers and letters. "You're searching for her," he said quietly. "I'm searching for the truth," she replied. "Who was she, really, and why do I feel like she's still here?" He exhaled, because part of her as he moved closer, pulling an old journal from the shelf. The leather cover was worn, the edges frayed. He handed it to her. "This was hers," he said. "I shouldn't have kept it, but I couldn't destroy it either." Alara opened it carefully. The handwriting was elegant but urgent, each page filled with notes about the house, the contract, and one recurring line that appeared again and again. "Freedom has a price no one can afford twice." Halfway through the journal, a page caught her eye. The ink was smudged as if written in haste. "He says it's a contract of protection, but I see the truth now. The contract doesn't bind me to him, it binds me to this place." Alara looked up sharply. She thought she was trapped here. Lucien's silence was confirmation enough. He sank into the chair opposite her, the weight of years pressing into his shoulders. "When Lydia disappeared, I told myself she ran away, that she found a way out I couldn't follow. But sometimes at night I hear her in the walls, in the rain." His voice cracked. "And now you're hearing her too." Alara wanted to deny it, but deep down she knew he was right. The house wasn't just holding memories, it was feeding on them. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered again. The storm had passed, leaving the corridors slick with moonlight. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way back to the hidden study behind Lydia's portrait. The air inside was cold, the dust disturbed as if someone had been there recently. She noticed a second door half hidden by a shelf ajar. She pushed it open. A narrow staircase spiraled downward, the walls lined with old wallpaper peeling in strips. The smell of damp stone filled the air. At the bottom, a single bulb flickered weakly, illuminating what looked like an underground archive: boxes, photographs, reels of old film, all labeled with dates and names. She brushed the dust from one of the boxes. The label read, "Contracted participants terminate." Her breath hitched. Inside were dozens of folders, each with a name, a signature, and a photograph clipped to the corner. Men, women, all different ages, and at the bottom of the stack her own file. Alara Hale status. Active, but there was something else scrawled beside it, in pen darker than the printed ink. Successor identified. Before she could read more, she heard footsteps behind her. Alara Lucien's voice came from the top of the stairs. She turned, the file trembling in her hands. "What is this? How many people? Too many," he said softly, stepping into the light. "You weren't supposed to find this." His expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between guilt and grief. "I thought I could end it after Lydia," he said, "but the contracts, they were never mine to destroy. Then whose?" she demanded. He hesitated, then pointed to a crest stamped on the folder's corner, a symbol she'd seen before carved into the mansion's gates. "The Vales built their empire on more than business," he said. "They built it on control. Generations of contracts like this binding people to their will, to their secrets. I inherited the house, the wealth, and the curse." Alara stared at him. "You're saying every person who signed one was absorbed into it, their names, their memories. Even their faces fade with time." His voice dropped. "The house keeps them." The light above them flickered violently, and the sound of footsteps echoed again, this time heavier, faster. Lucien spun toward the noise, but the corridor was empty. Then, faintly, a woman's laughter drifted through the hall. It was light, melodic and heartbreakingly familiar. "Lydia," Lucien whispered. He bolted forward, following the sound through the archive, through another door that led to an old stone passage beneath a mansion. Alara ran after him, the narrow tunnel twisting like the roots of an ancient tree. When they emerged, they were at the lake. The moon was high, pale and cold, reflecting perfectly on the still water. And there she was, A figure in silver stood at the water's edge, just as in Ilara's dreams. The gown shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Her hair fell like a curtain over her face. Lucien slowed, his voice trembling. "Lydia." The woman turned her head slightly, but the face wasn't Lydia's. It was. Ilara stumbled backward, her reflection breaking across the lake's surface. The figure smiled sadly. "It always ends the same," she said. Her voice was soft, distant, but it carried through the night air like a memory refusing to die. Lucien reached out as if to touch her, but she stepped backward into the water. The ripples swallowed her form, leaving only the reflection of the moon. The silence that followed was unbearable. Lucien fell to his knees, hands gripping the wet soil. "She's trapped," he whispered, "and now it's trying to take you to." Ilara's vision blurred. She could still hear the echo of the woman's words, "It always ends the same." "Then we end it differently," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. Lucien looked up at her, eyes hollow but searching. "You don't understand what that means." "Yes," she whispered. "I think I do." She turned toward the mansion, where the faint lights glowed through the windows like watching eyes. The wind carried the scent of rain and something older, something unspoken. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the truth Lydia had written in her journal wasn't just a warning, it was a prophecy. Freedom has a price no one can afford twice. And now, it was her turn to pay it. The wind rose, stirring the surface of the lake. Behind her, Lucien stood, torn between past and present. "Ilara," he said softly. She turned to face him. "If this place binds people to their choices, then someone has to break the pattern." His jaw tightened. "It will take you too, maybe," she said. "But maybe that's the point." Lightning flashed again, bathing the lake in white light. For a heartbeat, Ilara thought she saw them, all the faces of the ones who came before her. Their reflections rippling across the surface, waiting, and as the thunder rolled through the valley, she took a step toward the water, whispering to the storm, to Lydia, to herself. "Let this be the last contract." Then she stepped forward. The water rose around her ankles, cold and alive. Lucien reached out but stopped, because in that moment, for the first time, she didn't look afraid. And when the surface stilled again, the reflection that stared back wasn't hers anymore. It was someone new. The rain began to fall once more, soft at first, then harder, until the mansion behind them blurred into shadow. Lucien stood there alone, staring at the lake that had claimed them both. Somewhere beneath the thunder, a voice whispered, barely audible, carried by the wind. "Freedom, Lucien, but not for you. Not yet." He closed his eyes. And the lights in the mansion flickered out once more. For hours, Lucien didn't move. The rain had stopped, but the stillness that followed was unbearable, like the world itself had paused to hold its breath. The lake mirrored the bruised sky, smooth as glass, as if pretending nothing had happened. Only the faint ripples near the shore betrayed the truth that something had entered its depths and hadn't come back out. He waited until dawn before the weight of exhaustion forced him to turn away. His clothes clung to his skin, heavy with lake water and regret. Behind him, the mansion loomed, its pale windows dull and hollow, its reflection stretching across the water like a ghost reaching for him. Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The staff were gone. Every room stood open and stripped, as if the house had shed its own memory overnight. Even the portraits had changed. Where once eyes had watched him from every wall, they were now blank, the faces faded to near white canvas. In the grand foyer, a single object waited on the marble floor, Ilara's contract. The paper was dry despite the storm, her signature still clear, but the line that once bore her name was now empty, scrubbed clean, as if she'd never existed. Lucien sank to his knees. The echo of her voice lingered in his head, that final whisper, "Let this be the last contract." He'd heard words like that before. Lydia's voice had said something similar, years ago, but he hadn't listened then. He'd been too bound by legacy, too afraid to destroy what his family had built, what they had cursed him to preserve. Now, as morning light seeped weakly through the broken windows, he wondered if the curse had simply moved on. That night, he dreamed, he stood in the hallway of mirrors, each reflection showing a version of himself, older, younger, crueler, kinder. In every reflection, a woman stood beside him. Sometimes it was Lydia, sometimes Ilara, and sometimes a stranger whose face blurred before he could see it. They all whispered the same thing. "You keep us here." He jolted awake, breath ragged, sweat chilling his skin. The mansion was silent again, but not empty. There was a pulse in the air, a low, rhythmic thrum like a heartbeat inside the walls. He followed the sound, down the staircase, through the library, past the hidden study. The air grew colder as he descended into the archives beneath the house. The light flickered, faint but steady, guiding him toward the rows of boxes Ilara had found. He stopped when he saw it. Her file. It was open again, lying in the middle of the floor. But now there was a new note scrawled across the top in familiar handwriting. "Termination denied. Active status restored." His pulse quickened. "Ilara," he whispered, half to himself, half to the house. A faint sound answered him, water dripping, then a voice, soft, fragile, echoing through the tunnel. "Lucy." He spun toward it. The sound came from the far end of the corridor where the stone met an iron gate he'd never opened. A faint glow seeped from beneath it, pale and fluid, as though the lake's reflection had found its way underground. He pushed the gate open. Beyond it was a cavern, smooth walls slick with moisture, the air humming with energy. In the center, a pool of water shimmered, fed by a thin stream dripping from the ceiling. The water glowed faintly, like light trapped beneath its surface. And there she was. Elara stood at the edge of the pool, her hair damp, her skin luminous in the dim light. She turned when she heard him, her expression calm but unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. He took a step closer, disbelief sharpening his voice. "You're alive," she smiled faintly. "Alive isn't the right word anymore." Lucien froze. "I thought I drowned," she continued. "But the water didn't take me, it showed me." "Showed you what?" Her gaze flicked to the pool. "The truth about the contracts. About this place. About you." She knelt, touching the surface. Ripples spread outward, and for a moment he saw something beneath the water. Faces, countless faces drifting just below the surface like memories caught in glass. Lydia's face among them. "They're all here," Elara said. "Every person who ever signed one. Every soul that tried to buy freedom. The house isn't haunted, Lucien, it's inhabited." He shook his head, stepping back. "That's impossible, is it?" she whispered. "You said yourself this place doesn't forget what's buried inside it." Lucien's throat tightened. "Then how are you here? How did you come back?" "I didn't come back," she said. "I crossed over." The air grew colder. The hum of the walls deepened. She looked up at him, eyes glowing faintly with the same light as the water. "Lydia didn't vanish," she said. "She became part of it. She was the first to try breaking the cycle. When she failed, the contract consumed her. I thought I could end it differently, but I only finished what she started." Lucien stared at her. "You mean you're trapped?" "No," she said, standing, "not trapped, connected. The house feeds on the ones who try to escape, but I found a way to feed it something else, memory, love. That's what it never understood." He took another step toward her. "If you found a way to change it, then come back with me. We can destroy it together." Her expression softened. "You can't destroy what's part of you, Lucien." He froze. "Part of me," she nodded. "You're not just the air, you're the anchor. The reason it endures." The realization hit him like a physical blow. His entire life, the contracts, the house, the endless repetition of loss, it had never been random. The curse wasn't bound to him, it was bound through him. "That's why they stay," she said. "Because as long as you live, the cycle continues." The silence that followed was suffocating. Lucien's voice broke. "Then what do I do?" Elara reached out, her hand hovering inches from his cheek. "Let go." Before he could respond, the walls shuddered. The light from the pool flared, flooding the cavern with brilliance. The faces beneath the surface twisted and shifted, their mouths opening in silent cries. Elara looked toward the ceiling. "It's resisting. It knows you're close." The air filled with sound whispers, overlapping, desperate. The temperature dropped, the water roiling like something alive. Lucien grabbed her hand, holding tight. "Tell me how to end it," he shouted over the noise. She met his eyes. "You already know." He shook his head. "No, I can't." Her grip tightened. "Lucien, every contract ends the same way because you refuse to finish it. You save them, you love them, and then you let them go, but never yourself. You're the last signature." A sharp pain seared through his chest. The whispers grew louder, 1,000 voices echoing his name. The faces in the water began to rise. Lydia, the others all reaching upward as if to pull him in. Elara's voice was steady now. "If you end the contract, they'll be free. I'll be free. But you must choose to stay behind." He stared at her, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. "And you..." Her smile was sad. "I was never meant to stay." The light blazed once more. For a moment everything slowed, the air suspended, droplets of water frozen mid-air. And then, in the reflection of the pool, Lucien saw it, himself as a boy, signing his first contract under his father's watchful gaze. The ink had barely dried before his reflection had shifted into something colder. He'd been bound ever since. Tears stung his eyes. "I didn't know." "I know," she whispered. "But now you do." The cavern trembled, cracks spidering through the floor. The pool glowed brighter, the faces within it dissolving into light. "Elara," he said, voice breaking. "If I let go, will I see you again?" She leaned close, pressing her forehead to his. "When the house finally sleeps, maybe." And then she was gone. The water surged upward, swallowing the light, the sound, the world. Lucien fell to his knees, clutching his chest as the pulse of the house grew frantic, then faltered. Silence. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the cold floor of the study, morning light filtering through the curtains. The air smelled different, cleaner, lighter. The hum was gone. He rose slowly, his reflection caught in the glass of the window. For the first time, it looked like just that, a reflection. Not another version watching him, but something else caught his eye. On the desk lay the contract again, its edges curling slightly. The text had changed. "All contracts terminated. Anchor released," and beneath it, one final line appeared in new ink. "Freedom fulfilled. Lydia Vale 11." He touched the paper, and it dissolved to dust. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening to the silence. Then he turned toward the window where the lake shimmered faintly in the distance. A figure stood at the shores, more distant and familiar. Silver light flickered around her like mist. He blinked, and she was gone. That night, the mansion creaked softly as though exhaling after centuries of tension. The portraits on the walls had faded completely, leaving only empty frames. Lucian wandered from room to room, unsure if he was mourning or awakening. When he reached the east wing, he paused outside Alara's old chamber. On her desk lay a notebook, the same journal she'd carried everywhere. He opened it, and a single sentence was written inside. Every contract ends, but love leaves echoes. He closed the book, his fingers trembling. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, forgiving. He turned toward the lake once more. The reflection of the mansion wavered in the rippling water, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw her face again, smiling, free. And for the first time, Lucian didn't feel the pull of the curse. He felt the quiet ache of release. But then, as lightning flickered across the sky, he noticed something strange. The reflection in the water wasn't his. It was looking back at him, not with eyes of malice but recognition. And then it smiled. Lucian froze, because he realized, in that single flash of light, that maybe the house hadn't died at all. Maybe it had simply changed what it wanted, and this time, it had chosen him. The reflection's smile lingered just long enough to feel intentional. Lucian blinked, and the surface of the lake rippled, distorting everything: himself, the house, the memory of her. The rain hissed softly against the water, forming circles that swallowed the image, but the unease didn't fade. It clung to him, invisible but real, like the weight of a gaze he couldn't locate. He turned from the shore, but the air had changed. Every step toward the mansion felt heavier, as though gravity itself resisted him. The wind had died completely, yet the trees swayed anyway, creaking like old bones. When he crossed the threshold into the foyer, the silence met him like a wall, thick, breathless, aware. For the first time since the house had emptied, he felt watched again. He called out, softly at first, then louder, "Is someone here?" No answer, only the faint sound of dripping, steady, rhythmic, from somewhere above. He followed it through the corridor, up the grand staircase. The dripping led him toward the east wing, where Ilaros' room stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air was cold enough to mist his breath. The window was open, rain trailing down the curtains and pooling on the wooden floor. And on the writing desk, the same desk where her journal had rested, lay something new. A single piece of paper, wet but legible. It wasn't in her handwriting this time. It was his. He recognized it instantly. The curve of the letters, the slant of the ink. Contract renewal, Elvale. The room tilted around him. His pulse roared in his ears. "No," he whispered, backing away. "That's not possible." But the paper didn't lie. It bore the date of that very morning. The signature was unmistakably his, drawn with precision he didn't remember making. He tore the page in half. The sound was sharp, defiant, but the halves reformed in his hand, whole again. Outside, thunder cracked so close it shook the glass. Lucian stumbled back, heart hammering. He glanced toward the mirror on the far wall and froze. In the reflection, his hands were still holding the paper. But his reflection wasn't. It was watching him, calm and steady, a faint smile curling at its lips. Then, slowly, it raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. Lucian's pulse stuttered. He reached out on instinct, fingers trembling as they brushed the cold surface. The reflection's smile widened, and for a brief, dizzying moment, he felt something press back. A pulse, a heartbeat beneath the glass. He yanked his hand away. The mirror rippled like disturbed water, and the smile vanished. The room fell silent again, save for the soft patter of rain. He left the east wing and walked the halls aimlessly, but the silence followed him like a shadow. Every light seemed dimmer than before, every reflection warped, as though the house itself had begun to breathe again. By nightfall, he couldn't tell if the sound in his head was the storm or his own heartbeat. He poured himself a drink in the study, his father's old whiskey, untouched for years, and sat before the fire, its flicker barely illuminating the hollow room. He told himself he'd imagined the reflection, the paper, the smile. He'd been living with ghosts too long. Perhaps they'd simply decided to look back. But then, as the flames burned lower, he saw movement in the window. A figure, standing just beyond the glass, motionless in the rain. He rose slowly, not daring to blink. The figure was indistinct, a silhouette blurred by water and distance, but it was there, unmistakably watching him. He opened the door to the terrace, the cold air rushing in like a slap. The terrace was empty, only the sound of rain dripping steadily from the eaves, and the faint shimmer of the lake beyond. But as he turned to go back inside, something caught his eye: a footprint, wet, recent, pressed clearly into the stone. He crouched, touching it. The water within it was still rippling. He followed the prints across the terrace, down the steps, through the grass slick with rain. They led toward the old greenhouse, the one Lydia had built and Ilara had once loved to wander. Its glass panels were fogged over, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of wet earth and decay. Vines hung like veins from the rafters, curling around the cracked glass. And in the center of the floor, a chair sat facing a mirror. The same mirror from Ilara's room. Lucian froze. His reflection looked back at him again, but this time, it was not a mirror image. The man in the glass wasn't copying him, he was waiting. Lucien's own breath misted the air. The reflections did not. He whispered, "What do you want?" The reflection smiled faintly. Then it spoke. "You freed them," it said, voice low, almost tender. "Now you must replace them." Lucien stumbled backward. "No, the house cannot rest empty." The reflection continued. "It needs an anchor. You unbound the chains, Lucien, you must hold what remains." Lucien shook his head violently. "I ended it. It's over." But the reflection leaned closer, eyes gleaming with something too alive to be a trick of light. "Then why are you still here?" The question sank into him like a blade. He realized, with dawning horror, that he couldn't remember the last time he'd stepped outside the grounds. The world beyond the gates had blurred in his mind, streets, people, the city, all of it dissolving like smoke when he tried to recall it. Had he ever really left? The reflection reached toward the glass, and this time Lucien couldn't move. The surface rippled outward, not inward like water spilling into the world. A hand emerged, pale, impossibly solid, pressing against the air between them. He staggered back, but the hand followed, the arm stretching forward as though the mirror itself were being peeled open. Lucien grabbed the nearest object, a rusted metal rod, and swung it through the air. The glass shattered in a burst of sound and light, fragments flying across the floor like shards of frozen rain. The reflection vanished. The silence that followed was immediate and deafening. His chest heaved. He dropped the rod, stepping back, waiting for anything to move again. But the greenhouse stayed still. The only sound was the slow dripping of water from the ceiling. And then, one by one, the shards of glass began to vibrate. He watched in horror as they slid across the floor, drawn together as if by a magnetic force. They reassembled not into a mirror this time, but into a shape, a form, a human silhouette, rising from the floor, light glowing faintly within it. Lucien turned and ran. He burst out of the greenhouse into the rain, his footsteps echoing across the courtyard. Behind him, glass crunched and shifted, the faint hum of something awakening filling the air. By the time he reached the mansion doors, the storm had begun again, furious and sudden, lightning cracking above the lake. He slammed the doors shut and bolted them, his hands trembling. The house felt alive now, its walls shivering with energy. The portraits that had been blank were changing again, shapes emerging where there had been emptiness, eyes forming, faces half remembered. He recognized some of them, Lydia, Alara, and others, dozens of others. They weren't looking at him, they were looking behind him. Lucien turned. The reflection stood in the doorway, not inside the glass anymore, but in the flesh or something like it. Its eyes were dark mirrors, its smile faintly familiar. It looked exactly like him, down to the smallest scar. "Why?" Lucien whispered. "Because the contract was never meant to end," the reflection said softly. "It was meant to transfer." Lightning flared, and in its brief light, the two men faced each other, the living and the reflection, the anchor and the echo. "You freed them," the reflection continued, stepping closer. "Now you take their place. The house needs balance, Lucien. It always has." Lucien backed away, his breath uneven. "No, I destroyed the contracts. I ended the curse." The reflection tilted its head. "Did you?" It raised its hand again, and the walls around them flickered, furniture, shadows, portraits, all pulsing between reality and memory. The house was rewriting itself, threads of time unraveling and reweaving. Lucien felt the ground shift beneath him. A wave of vertigo struck as the world twisted, and suddenly he wasn't in the mansion anymore. He was standing in the study again, but younger. The desk pristine, the air thick with tobacco and oak. His father sat across from him, the pen poised above a contract. "Sign it," his father said, voice calm, steady. "Every veil does." Lucien wanted to shout, to refuse, but his hand moved anyway, obedient, tracing the same signature he'd seen on the paper in Alara's room. As the ink dried, his reflection in the glass cabinet smiled back at him, and then he was back in the present, gasping, drenched in cold sweat. The reflection was gone, but its voice lingered, low and distant, echoing through the walls. "You can't destroy what you are, Lucien. You can only choose how long you bear it." The storm outside reached its peak, thunder shaking the floors. Lucien stumbled toward the grand hall, where the great mirror, the oldest in the house, waited. Its surface pulsed faintly, light rippling beneath it, like trapped lightning. He approached it slowly. His reflection stared back, not smiling this time, just watching, waiting. He realized then that every reflection in the house, every pane of glass, every shimmer in the lake was connected. They weren't just windows, they were doors, and they were all opening. The floor beneath him trembled, cracks split across the marble, light seeping through them like veins of fire. The portraits glowed, the walls groaned. He pressed a hand against the mirror, whispering to no one and to everything at once. "What do you want from me?" The reflection's lips moved in perfect unison. To remember, Lucien's heart lurched. Remember what? The mirror darkened. His reflection dissolved into smoke, and then the answer came not in words, but in memory. The faces, the voices, the countless signatures. They weren't bound to the house, they were bound to him. The lightning outside flared again, brighter than before, flooding the room in white. Lucien staggered back as the light expanded, swallowing the hall. the house, everything around him. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, 1,000 mirrors breaking at once. He covered his face, the brilliance searing his vision, and then the silence. When he opened his eyes, the light was gone. The house was still. The lake was calm. But the mirror in front of him no longer showed his reflection. It showed someone else, a woman, standing in the ruins of the greenhouse, holding the same journal he'd once found on Elara's desk. She looked directly at him through the glass, and smiled. "Your turn," she whispered. The air around him shivered, and before he could breathe, the glass began to move again. The glass moved like a living thing, bending light and shadow in slow liquid waves. The woman's smile flickered, and then her hand reached toward him through the surface, through reality itself. Lucien didn't move this time. He couldn't. The air around him had thickened, a shimmering pulse that hummed through his veins. Her fingers brushed his cheek, cold as breath in winter, and suddenly he was somewhere else. The house vanished. The storm, the marble, the firelight, all of it dissolved into a pale field of mist. He stood alone beneath a colorless sky. Time didn't exist here. Even his heartbeat sounded muffled, as though underwater. And then, shapes began to appear in the fog. Dozens at first, then hundreds, faint, transparent outlines of people, men, women, even children, each holding a page, a pen, or a fragment of mirror. They were the signatures, the ones who had signed before him. Their faces were neither angry nor kind. They were waiting, expectant, like witnesses at the end of a trial. Lucien tried to speak, but his voice vanished into the mist. The woman stepped forward again, her hair dark against the pale air. Her eyes were the same as Elara's, soft, haunting, unknowable. But there was something older behind them, something that stretched far beyond the woman he'd once known. "You thought it was the house," she said quietly. But the walls were never alive on their own. Her words echoed, overlapping as though the voices of all those behind her spoke with her. It was built to contain what others feared to remember. The pain, the bargains, the guilt. Lucien felt his knees weaken. Then what was I? She took another step closer. The mist rippled around her like a tide. "You were the keeper, the memory that holds the rest together. Every generation needed one. I didn't choose this, you did. Every veil before you did. The contract wasn't forced, it was begged for. A way to hide what you could not bear to face. You thought you were binding the curse, but you were only hiding the truth inside yourselves." He shook his head. "No, You freed Elara because she remembered who she was," she said softly. "But you never remembered who you were." The air shuddered. For an instant, the mist tore open and Lucien saw flashes of memory, not his own. A young woman's laughter. A hand reaching for his. A body buried beneath oak leaves, fire licking at parchment. A promise whispered under moonlight. He saw the first signature. The original one. It wasn't his ancestors, it was his. He gasped, stumbling backward. "That's not yes," she said. "You began it." The images flooded faster. Centuries collapsing into seconds. Each life, each generation, a reflection of the same man reborn under a new name, repeating the same vow to protect what could not be undone. The veil line wasn't a bloodline, it was a cycle. A single soul bound to memory, rewritten again and again. Lucien clutched his head as the truth poured through him like light through cracks in glass. He saw himself through countless mirrors, signing, breaking, loving, losing, each lifetime a variation of the same story, the same desperate attempt to escape what he had once created. He fell to his knees. The mist pulsed with every heartbeat. "I don't want this," he whispered. "I just want it to end." The woman knelt beside him. Her touch softened, almost human again. "Then end it, Lucien. But ending means remembering, all of it." The ground beneath them began to tremble. The mist peeled away, revealing fragments of the house floating in the void rooms, hallways, portraits, staircases, suspended like broken constellations. The glass of every mirror was glowing, and within each one, a different version of him stared back, some afraid, some defiant, some hollow. "Every version of you chose differently," the woman said. "Some fled, some stayed, some burned the house, some rebuilt it. But all of you forgot. You can only be free when you stop running from what you began." Lucien stood slowly, looking into the mirrors that surrounded him, faces upon faces, each one carrying a lifetime's worth of sorrow. He could feel them inside him, echoes of choices, regrets, promises left unfinished. "What did I begin?" he asked, his voice breaking. The woman looked past him, toward the faint silhouette of the lake shimmering in the distance. "Love," she said simply, and the fear of losing it. The word struck him like thunder. He saw her now not just as Elara, not just as a ghost. He saw her as she had been the first time. The woman he'd loved before the contract ever existed. Before the house, before the curse. The one he had tried to preserve by binding her soul to memory, refusing to let her fade. He hadn't built a prison to contain evil. He had built it to keep love alive. But love, when trapped, turns into something else. The fog deepened again, the air charged with emotion too vast to name. He could feel every life, every echo of his own guilt and longing pressing down on him, urging him to make the choice he'd avoided for centuries. "Then tell me," he said quietly, "how do I end it?" The woman met his gaze. "Let go of what you've tried to keep. Let her go. Let yourself go." The mirrors around him began to crack. The sound was beautiful and terrible at once, like crystal rain. The light inside them fled brighter with every fracture. He turned to the woman. "And if I do, then the house will die. And with it, every reflection, every version of you, every lie." He looked around. The mirrors were shattering faster now. The faces within them were fading, one by one, as though relieved. Lucien stepped forward. The air vibrated around him, charged with a hum of collapsing time. "If that's what it takes," he whispered, "then let it end." He reached for the last mirror, the great one that had always stood in the hall, the one that had watched him since the beginning. His reflection waited there, still, silent eyes filled with quiet understanding. They shared a breath. Then, together, they touched the glass. The world broke open. A shockwave of light tore through everything: the house, the lake, the forest, erasing walls, dissolving shadows, until all that remained was light. For a heartbeat, he felt everything: the love, the pain, the endless repetition blending into something vast and peaceful. The faces he had carried for centuries were no longer trapped. They were rising, shimmering like fireflies into the sky. The woman smiled, her edges blurring. "You've done it," she whispered. "You've remembered." "Will I remember this?" he asked, his voice almost gone. She stepped closer, touched his chest where his heart beat wildly, not in words but in feeling. He closed his eyes. The last thing he saw was her face dissolving into light, and the reflection of himself finally smiling, not from a mirror, but from within. When he opened his eyes again, there was no house, no rain, no sound but the wind moving through tall grass. He stood in an open field, dawn breaking along the horizon. The lake was still there, but smaller now, quiet and unburdened. The air smelled of earth and renewal. He looked down. In his hand, he held the same journal, but the pages were blank. He turned one over. On the final page, faint handwriting appeared, ink spreading like dawn. "To escape is to remember what binds you. To love is to let go." He smiled faintly, the ache in his chest soft but human. The weight was gone. A figure appeared at the edge of the field, walking slowly toward him. The same woman, but different now. Alive, real. Her face unshadowed by memory. He felt no fear this time, only quiet recognition. They stopped a few steps apart. She looked at him, the wind lifting her hair, and said simply, "You came back." He nodded. "I had to." For a moment neither spoke. The silence was full but gentle, like the pause between waves. Then she reached out, and he took her hand, warm, real. The ground beneath them hummed softly, the last trace of the house's magic sinking into the earth. In its place grew something: green grass, wildflowers, life reclaiming what had been held too long. Lucien turned toward the horizon. The light of morning spilled over the land, erasing the last remnants of shadow. He exhaled. It wasn't the breath of release or despair. It was the first true breath he had taken in centuries. The woman squeezed his hand. "What now?" He looked at her, smiled. "We live." The light grew brighter, wrapping them in warmth, and for the first time there were no reflections, no echoes, just the sound of wind and the steady rhythm of two hearts, real, imperfect, free. But far beyond the field, beneath the still surface of the lake, something shimmered just once, a flicker, a ripple, a heartbeat of light that might have been memory or might have been the start of something new. Lucien felt it faintly, like a whisper in his chest. The reflection's voice, his own, echoed softly in the wind. "Remember, not the curse, the love." And as the sun rose fully over the world, the last of the house's shadows disappeared, leaving behind only what had always been there to souls, walking toward the horizon, unbound, remembered, alive. The sun climbed higher, turning the lake to glass. Lucien stood at its edge, the wind tugging at his coat, and watched the ripples fade one by one. Each wave seemed to erase a memory, smoothing the surface until it reflected nothing but sky. It was strange how stillness could feel so loud, how silence could hum with everything left unsaid. He had thought the end would come with fire, or thunder, or some grand act of erasure. But it came like this instead, soft, unassuming, like morning after a long night that no one believed would end. The woman stood a few steps behind him. He could feel her presence without turning. It wasn't the haunted stillness that had followed him before. It was different now, steady, alive. The air between them no longer crackled with something bound or unfinished. It moved easily, like wind through an open door. She knelt beside the water, fingers brushing the surface. The reflection that looked back wasn't a ghost or a duplicate, it was simply her, lit by sunlight. For a moment, Lucien almost didn't recognize the simplicity of it. No distortion, no echo, just two people reflected, side by side. "This is where it began," she said quietly. Lucien nodded. "And where it ends, does it?" she asked, eyes tracing the horizon. "Or does it just begin again somewhere else?" He didn't answer. He wasn't sure anymore if endings were real things or simply pauses between breaths. Maybe every ending was just a continuation that had forgotten its name. The thought didn't frighten him. It felt right somehow. He sat beside her, the earth damped beneath his palms. "I remember everything now," he said. "All the lives, all the choices, the reasons, and I understand." He looked at her, the sunlight cutting through his eyes like gold through water. "Every contract I signed was a promise not to forget, but every promise became a cage. I thought I was protecting love by keeping it alive. But love doesn't live in preservation. It only lives in surrender. She smiled faintly, her reflection folding into the light. You were afraid to lose it. I was afraid to lose myself in it, he corrected softly. But now I think that's what love was meant to do. The wind lifted, scattering petals across the grass, pale blossoms from some unseen tree. They landed on the lake, floated, and began to sink slowly, one by one. Lucian watched them disappear beneath the surface. He thought of the house, how it had once stood here, grand and impossible, built from memory and fear. Now, all that remained was this quiet place, where the lake met the field, and time seemed to hesitate before moving on. The woman turned toward him. You could rebuild it, if you wanted to. He shook his head. No, the world doesn't need another reflection. It needs a window. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded as though she understood something deeper than words could reach. Then what will you do now? Lucian breathed in deeply, the scent of wet earth filling his lungs. Live, he said again, the word sounding truer this time. Just live, without trying to bind it, or name it, or keep it. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll forget. And if you forget again, he smiled, then maybe someone else will remember for me. The light shifted across the water, and for a heartbeat, he saw a movement beneath the surface faces, faint and shimmering, like sunlight caught on glass. But they weren't trapped anymore. They were drifting upward, dissolving into beams of color that joined the sky. He recognized some of them, his father, Ilara, and countless others whose names he'd once carried like stones. Their features softened as they rose, until all that was left were points of light vanishing into the morning. He felt no pain, no regret, only gratitude. The woman stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. It's strange, she said, looking around, how quiet everything is now. It's not quiet, Lucian murmured. It's full, and it was. The air vibrated faintly with life, the chirp of distant birds, the rustle of leaves, the sound of the lake breathing against its edges. He realized that this silence was not emptiness, it was presence. They began walking along the shore, not speaking for a while. The world around them seemed newly made, every detail crisp and unfamiliar, the smell of pine, the glitter of dew, the warmth of sunlight unfiltered by ghosts. As they reached the edge of the field, Lucian paused. Do you remember the first contract? He asked. The woman tilted her head. Yes, what did it say? She smiled. That love is not owned, it's offered, and if it's taken it must be given again. He nodded. Maybe that's the only real truth there ever was. They stood together, watching the light climb higher, until it painted everything in gold. In the distance, a small cottage came into view, a modest thing, stone and wood, with smoke curling from the chimney. Lucian didn't remember it being there, but it felt right, like something that had always waited for him. They walked toward it slowly, each step deliberate, quiet. Inside, the air smelled of herbs and warmth. There were no mirrors, no contracts, no remnants of the old house, only shelves lined with books and a single table set for two. She moved through the space as if she already knew it. He stood at the window, watching the lake shimmer in the distance. This feels borrowed, he said softly. Maybe everything does, she replied. He turned to her. Do you ever wonder if we're still inside one of the mirrors? If this is just another reflection pretending to be real? She smiled. Does it matter? He thought about that for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No, not anymore. She set a pot on the stove, the scent of tea rising to fill the room. He sat across from her, and for the first time, their conversation wasn't weighted by what had been or what might come. It just was. As they drank, sunlight slipped across the floorboards, stretching toward the open door. Outside, the lake glimmered faintly, a soft breeze rippling its surface. Lucian closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the cup sink into his palms. He thought of all the lives that had led to this, of the ink on parchment, the bloodlines, the promises, the reflections. He thought of how many times he tried to hold on to what he loved, only to realize that love's true form was not something you could possess. It was something you stepped into, like light. He opened his eyes again. The woman was watching him, her expression unreadable but kind. What? He asked. Nothing, she said. You just looked free. He smiled at that, a small, quiet smile that didn't need to reach his eyes to be real. Maybe I finally am. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint echo, not of sorrow, but of song. The sound of voices long gone, blending with the world around them until it was impossible to tell where the memory ended and the present began. He listened, and for the first time, didn't try to name the feeling that rose in him. It was too big for language. It was everything and nothing at once. After a while, he stood and stepped outside. The woman followed. Together, they watched as the sky deepened into the color of evening. The lake reflected the clouds like molten silver. The last light of day rippled across the water, and Lucian thought of all the reflections that had once haunted him. He realized now they were never meant to be prisons. They were reminders, each one showing him a version of himself waiting to be understood. He picked up a stone and skimmed it across the surface. It skipped once, twice, then sank quietly. The ripples it left behind spread far, overlapping, touching the farthest edges of the lake. The woman slipped her hand into his. Do you think it ever really ends? He thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said finally. "But maybe it doesn't have to." The wind carried his words across the water. Somewhere beyond sight, the faintest echo of laughter responded his own, from a time he barely remembered. The sky dimmed to dusk, stars flickering into being. They stood there until the chill set in, until the lake became a mirror, again calm, endless, clear. Lucian gazed at it one last time. This reflection was different. It didn't pull him in. It didn't whisper or plead. It just existed, waiting to be seen. He smiled. "I think," he said softly, "that the curse was never the contract. It was the forgetting." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And now, he said, "we remember." They turned back toward the cottage, their figures small against the vast, sleeping world. The door closed behind them, and for a long moment, only the sound of the lake remained. Then, slowly, the first fireflies of the night appeared, tiny lights rising from the grass, hovering above the water like souls set free. The reflection of their glow danced across the lake's surface, bright, weightless, alive. And in that fragile shimmer of light and stillness, the story that had begun with a contract and a cage became something else entirely, not an ending, not a beginning. Just the quiet truth that sometimes, to escape, you must first remember what it means to be free. The lake breathed once more, and the world at last was still.